from Easter to Pentecost is 50 days, and that explains why the festival of Pentecost is called that. It is the Greek word for the 50th day, and it is the 50th day after Easter, but it was also a Jewish festival, 50 days after Passover. And in this season, the 50 days between Easter and Pentecost, the Bible readings that are appointed by the church and have been the case, this lectionary has been in place from about the 500s or 600s. I don't choose these passages. These passages have been set in this order for well over a millennium and a half. And the theme that we get in these 50 days is indeed resurrection. The gospel readings themselves refer to resurrection. There are a number of resurrections that happened during the time of the apostles, and we read from the book of the Acts of the Apostles that there were a number of resurrections, including the one we read about today, the resurrection of Tabitha. The gospel reading for today described Jesus healing a paralytic. And it is no accident that this is appointed today, because the Greek word for get up or arise in the more old-fashioned way is actually either egiron or anasta. Anasta means get up, as does egire. So whenever these words are used, they are understood to be connected with the resurrection, not just from getting up from death to life, but think about the man that we read about today, 38 years disabled, 38 years paralyzed, might as well have been dead. He was forgotten by everyone. When Jesus said to him, "Do you want to be better?" he didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. The thing that hurt him the most was, "Lord, I don't have anyone." That's what hurt him the most. I don't have anyone. I don't have anyone to help me. I don't have anyone to push me into this water, because that's what he was doing at that pool. It was a miraculous pool. And every now and then there would be a miraculous stirring of the water, and whoever would fall in to this pool would be healed of their disease or condition. But he was paralyzed, he was disabled, he couldn't do it. He had no one to do the job for him, to lift him and push him in there at the right time. And so his biggest complaint was anthropon ukecho. I don't have anyone. He was dead to others, no doubt. And Jesus says to him, "Arise, pick up your mattress and walk." That is certainly a very powerful parallel to resurrection. But what I'd like to talk about today is Tabitha. Tabitha was a woman in the city of Iopi, or Joppa. If you were to go to Israel today, you would find that there is a city on the coast of the Mediterranean called Joppa, Iopi. And by this stage, only a couple of years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is a strong Christian community in Joppa. And as is quite characteristic of Christian communities, Christians have done from back then what we do today. We follow their example. They would gather to worship, they would gather to conduct the Eucharist, the sharing of bread and wine as body and blood of Christ, and expressing their unity both with God and with each other. They shared meals together, they worked together, and of course, Christians and Christian communities of all ages and all generations have always engaged in acts of charity. Tabitha, was one of these champions of charity. And it is often the case that in many churches in Greece who have philoptochi adelphotites, which is, of course, in every church there is a group that is committed and dedicated to doing acts of charity and acts of giving. Tabitha is sometimes their patron saint. Tabitha is the Hebrew or Aramaic word for a deer, as in a deer in the forest, D-double-E-R, a deer. And the Greek word for deer is dorkada, and it is translated into Greek in the original. So here we have a champion of charity, someone who would always dedicate herself to helping the poor. We know that she would make certain clothing, covers, what we would term blankets and covers today. She was like a seamstress, and she would create things that poor people would be in need of. Now, the unfortunate thing was that she died. She died early. And it is unfortunately often the case that we find and see that people who we perceive as very good people have a short life. But by the same token, we have good people who live a long life. Saint Vasilios, the Great, only lived to 50. And he is up there as one of the most famous church fathers. What he left us in those 50 years might as well have lived 150 years. And it's often the case that people who do commit themselves and give themselves to that extent, not that I'm saying that brings about an early end. It may, I don't know, biologically speaking, but that's not what matters. What matters is that they've done their thing. They've achieved what they needed to achieve. And God knows that Saint Vasilios, for example, and if you look at icons of Saint Vasilios, black beard, black hair. He died at 50 years old. His time had come. He had done enough. His example, his writings, his voluminous writings, if you put all his books together, they're like this on your shelf. And others of us who have lived 70 years have produced nothing. Point being is, he has done what he needed to do. On the other side of the spectrum, we have someone like Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony, Saint Antonius the Great of Egypt, lived in the wilderness, deprived of food, normal food. There were no fridges up until only 50, 60 years ago. In those days, there was no storage of food. If you lived in the desert of Egypt, there was no tree to go and get fruit from. If you lived in the desert of Egypt, there was no grain to go and get. You lived off dried bread. Whatever you got, let's say today, you would dry it in the sun, dry it with heat, and you lived off that for months on end until the next amount of bread came through. And water. Obviously, near the Nile there would have been some water, and perhaps they kept some water in jars. But for all of you who know what the climate is in Egypt, it only rains 3 days in Egypt in the year. A very harsh life, a life of deprivation, a life of no comfort. Not even living in a house. He lived in the wilderness, in caves. How long did Saint Anthony live? 100 plus. So we can't necessarily draw parallels about how much did they expend themselves and their bodies and therefore they died early. No. It doesn't work that way. You get both things. You get both young people deceasing and you have old people deceasing, and sometimes there need not be an explanation. Tabitha, same story. Young woman, committed and given to charity and works and good works, helping the poor, and once again, maybe God had his reasons. The community, the Christian community of Iopi, learned that Peter, the Apostle Peter, was in town and that he had just healed a disabled man called Aeneas. The first thing they thought was, go get Peter. Go and get Peter. Petros. And Peter comes to the house where Tabitha was laying. And the message that went out from the Christians was, please come to us without delay. So the act of love here did not come initially from Tabitha necessarily. It did not come initially, it wasn't initiated by Peter. It was initiated by the community, the church of Iopi. And this illustrates the importance of us not living our faith just for ourselves. Not saying, and we hear this all the time and we grew up hearing this, oh, religion is a private matter. To an extent, it is a private matter. To an extent, it is what I do in my life. Yes, of course. To an extent, Jesus preached that when you pray, go into your own room and pray. Don't show off when you pray. But by the same token, he prayed in company. He prayed with his disciples. The disciples prayed with their communities. There is a place for doing this together. There is a place for praying together. There is a place for working together for the greater good. And look at the result. Had Tabitha not been part of a community, had she thought to herself, religion is a private matter for myself. I'll pray in my room. I've got my relationship with God. I don't need to make things for the poor. Works won't save me. Just my faith. Well, she just would have died and that was it. But no, she had a community behind her. And the community, the rest of the group of the Christians of Iopi are the ones who reach out to Apostle Peter. Let's see what happened. Peter immediately goes with those who came to call him, and when he had arrived, they took him to the upper room. That's where Tabitha was. All the widows stood beside him weeping and showing tunics and other garments which Dorcas, Tabitha, made while she was with them. In other words, appreciation. Because the poor people of the time, as I said last week, if you're a widow, you're definitely on the poverty line. You'd be homeless, invariably. But Peter put them all outside. So he asks them all to exit, and he knelt down and prayed. Look what Peter does. He kneels down and prays, an example to us. Then turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And the Greek is Tabitha, anastithi, which means both get up, but also be resurrected. Those two words are overlapping. So Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and lifted her up. Then, calling the saints, that's a New Testament way of describing the community of the church, phonissas de τους Αγίους, calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. and he became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Strong, powerful. Peter does not do this act of this miracle by himself. Like Jesus was the one doing the miracles. He directly does the miracle. But Peter refers to Jesus almost always. There might be one or two exceptions to this in the Acts of the Apostles, but almost always Peter refers to Jesus Christ or God. And that is explained by him kneeling down and praying. Because when Jesus was doing miracles, straight miracle. Peter kneels down and prays before he's able to know that through the power of the Holy Spirit he's able to do the miracle. So brothers and sisters, so many bits and pieces, so many little messages that we can take home today. First and foremost, the importance of community, that we are believers, plural. We're not one on our own, and our personal relationship with God, which needs to exist before you can have communal worship anyway, obviously. But one should lead to the other, and communal worship should inspire you for personal worship at home and personal prayer. We feed off each other, we help each other, we grow together. The second message is the importance of acts of charity and good works. And I commend all of you who participate in the various ministries and activities of the church that relate to giving and charity, and that can take on so many forms. This is an opportunity for me to commend and encourage you to consider perhaps joining our Philoptochos Society, our Ladies Auxiliary, which also commits itself to such acts of charity and good works. And we could do with as much help as we can. But also for the rest of you who, in your own way, participate in the various acts of charity and ministries, either of our church or other churches, in your own special way. Having mentioned the word special, that's the whole idea, that we Christians need to stand out from the normal, be special in that sense, which is exactly what the word agios means in Greek and why it's used in the New Testament to refer to the community of the Christians, because we should not be like everyone else. We need to stand out, we need to be special, we need to pioneer in faith and acts of love, like Tabitha Vorkas. And the final message is that when we pray, when we seek to achieve something in life, there is a place for kneeling and praying. It's probably a good point to raise now that between Easter and Pentecost, there is a custom that we don't kneel in the Orthodox Church because we are focused on the message of the resurrection. The rest of the year we kneel. We can kneel. We kneel when we want to kneel. We kneel when our heart is broken. We kneel when we want to pray more fervently. We kneel at the epiklesis. When we consecrate the gifts at every liturgy, we kneel. And as I said, we don't do it for 50 days because we are in a different feel, a different spirit, the resurrectional spirit. But the rest of the year, kicking off from Pentecost, we get back to kneeling. It is a bit of a tragedy that in the Orthodox churches around the world, where you don't understand how this custom works, we have this application of a canon in a strict way which says we should not be kneeling on Sundays. There is a guideline in the canons of the church that says do not kneel on Sundays. Why? Because every Sunday is a resurrectional themed day. And that stands. We encourage our people not to be kneeling during the service on Sundays. But the epiclesis is its own little class of kneeling. And we should be kneeling at the epiclesis. And if you notice, bishops, priests and deacons always kneel at the epiclesis, that moment. And we don't kneel the rest of the service because we are in as I said, an attitude of looking up, resurrectionally speaking. Now, when you apply that canon or that guideline to, well, don't kneel on Sundays ever, then what ends up happening is you come to a weekday service and you've never learnt to kneel, neither at the epiclesis nor any other time in the service. Let's extend that a little bit more. So you go Sundays without kneeling, you go weekdays without kneeling, you go home and you don't kneel when you pray, you end up not kneeling ever. And I think that's the opposite of what the canon was trying to achieve. Kneeling in prayer is important. It brings down our pride. It gives us humility. It's a big difference to pray when you're kneeling, and it's very, very important that we do so. So, everything in balance, everything has its place. I've shared that with you because maybe there was a question in your head about why aren't we kneeling on Sundays now? I gave you the answer. We will be kneeling again from Pentecost onwards at the epiclesis, and then in other services as much as you feel you need to kneel.